Well, I don't know where you live, but have you ever wondered how it is that you live where you do? What is it about the area that you live in, and how was it designed that ended up with you living there? You might find you speak the same language as the people in the same area, that you're of the same financial class of the people in your area. Professor Noor Nieftagodien is a professor of history. He is someone who's studied this deeply. Professor, good afternoon to you. Thank you for your time. The fact that we all live where we live, usually with people who speak the same language we do and have the same income we do, that's not an accident, is it?
No, not at all. And thanks for the opportunity, Stephen. I think it's worthwhile reminding ourselves that this year is the 50th anniversary of the promulgation of the Group Areas Act, which was one of the first acts that was passed by the National Party after it came to power in 1948. Together with the Group Areas Act, the National Party also promulgated what was known as the Population Registration Act. And it's important that those two acts were promulgated around the same time, because as you've suggested, what the Group Areas Act did was to augment, further entrench racial, spatial planning and divisions, mainly in the urban areas, but in fact across the country. It's worthwhile reminding ourselves, Stephen, that the Group Areas Act of 1950 was a sort of culmination of policy that had evolved over generations that sought to divide mainly the urban areas, but increasingly also the rural areas along racial lines. And it goes back, 150 years before the Group Areas Act was passed. But from the late 19th century, a series of acts were passed, such as the creation of compounds, something called the Gold Law, which created what was then called Asiatic bazaars, that separated people that were defined as Asian into particular areas mainly in the Transvaal, but also elsewhere, where they were forced to live and also trade. And then in the 1910s, 1920s, you had various other pieces of legislation that was promulgated. What the 1950 Act did was to consolidate all of those pieces of legislation. And with the ideological commitment of the National Party, the Group Areas Act empowered the new government, the apartheid government, not only to make racial segregation compulsory along the lines of the Population Registration Act, because what that act did was to say, the Population Registration Act, that broadly speaking, there were four so-called races, and that the Group Areas Act henceforth would separate people into residential areas according to the races defined by the Population Registration Act. And what one saw in the aftermath of the 1950 Group Areas Act was that a number of places across the country, you had inner city locations, what the government at the time then called black spots. And these black spots were places such as Sophia Town, Dukatole, District 6, across the country, where people who were defined as different races had been living together, sometimes for more than 100 years. In a sense, what the Group Areas Act empowered the National Party to do was to unscramble the egg, to forcibly separate people along racial lines. And over the next 25, 30 years, one had a systematic process of forcibly removing people from these areas, these so-called black spots, into racially defined residential areas. And these, it's important also to remind ourselves that, a sort of precursor of this was the 1913 Land Act. And what the 1913 Land Act did in broad terms was to say that South Africa belonged, that 87% of South Africa belonged to white people, right? And that African people would be confined to what became the Bantustans from the 1960s. So in the urban areas were defined as white areas. And black people, particularly African people, were only allowed into the urban areas if they were deemed worthy of work, employment for white people. Over time, as urbanization increased, the state recognized that it needed to assert far greater control over the lives of Black people. And one mechanism that they used to assert that kind of control was to place people in townships and colored and Indian group areas that were organized in such a way that made them much easier to control. So, for example, I could just use the key example that most people know, was that many African townships had one access point. And that meant that the state could control who went in and who left the township. And you typically had pass officers at the entrance of these townships. So there were two things happening simultaneously. One, racial segregation that was implemented with much greater vigor from the 1950s through forced removals and the creation of these kind of massive locations, townships, and also asserting tighter control over the lives of people who lived in these areas. And that, I'm making the point about the 1950 Land Act, and also indicating that it was a culmination of generations of policy, so that we understand that the spatial planning that we still live with today, the apartheid landscape, has developed over more than 100 years. Undoing that requires a lot more political will than I think is evident at the moment.
Professor, it's such an important conversation. Thank you for the introduction. We're going to continue with this conversation with Professor Noor Nieftagodien in just a moment. Stay with us. Good afternoon, welcome back. Well, you with Newsfeed, we continue, of course, one of our conversations related to the National Day of Reconciliation. We're speaking to Professor Noor Nieftagodien, a historian, an urban historian in particular, who's been looking at the divisions around how we live. And I started by making the point that it's no accident that you probably live in an area where most people speak the same language you do and have roughly the same income. And Professor, welcome back. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about this, I mean, I suppose, it was social engineering, and this phrase social engineering, I don't know if it's the right phrase, but this phrase at the time was deliberate social engineering. I mean, that's what it was. We were going to say, the government at the time said, we want people who look like this to live here and people who look like this to live there. That's what they did. Now, to change it requires, I would think, social engineering. In it, a lot of people would say social engineering is inherently wrong. Is it?
Yes, although it's a very interesting point that you're raising, because what we require is re-engineering, isn't it? That we need to undo what exists, what is deeply embedded in the physical landscape of the country. And that physical landscape, which came about through, as I was saying earlier, decades of social engineering that accelerated under apartheid, will require social engineering, if by that we mean state intervention, deliberate state intervention, to set us on a new path of spatial reorganization. And we do need that. Now, of course, social engineering does imply, negative intervention by the state. But of course, one can also have very positive state intervention. In South Africa, we have the grant system, right? That's state intervention. We have had in South Africa a massive housing program, the RDP housing program, that has delivered, depending on, whose figures one believes, but around 3 million housing for people. And the creation of the RDP villages has, in fact, can be seen as a form of social engineering. But I think that it's probably better to move away from that terminology and focus our attention on and recognize that what happened under apartheid was social engineering, informed by racist ideas, informed by the desire to control the lives of Black people, separate people along racial lines. What we require is a state intervention to challenge that, to undo that, and also recognize that it's going to take some time to do that. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that we have missed one opportunity to do this. In the last 26 years, the state has, as we've said earlier, built around 3 million RDP houses. Most of those houses have been built in areas either in or next to existing apartheid townships. And what it has done has been to reinforce apartheid geography. Now, what are we going to do henceforth to try and challenge the apartheid geography? I think it's extremely difficult because of this missed opportunity of the last 26 years. Because what we have is that by and large, poor people still remain in poor areas. Sections of the black middle class, not all of them, but significant sections of the middle class, have been able to buy houses, move out of the old locations into what was formerly white areas. So we're seeing this overlay between the racial apartheid spatial planning and increasingly a class spatial division being reinforced across the country. And if we leave it, to put it in these terms, only to the so-called market forces, then we will, in a generation's time, have exactly the same spatial organization of the country.
So,
And because we are such an unequal society, it will probably be firmly entrenched.
it's fascinating because around the world there is this thing. There is an English word, it's a British word, but it applies to all of Europe and America. It's called "not in my backyard," a NIMBY. You're someone who lives in an area and you oppose change in your area, and you'll hear immediately if someone says we're going to move people into your area, we're going to use your area for accommodation, we're going to build a railway. There will be two words, "not in my backyard," and the second is what will happen to the value of my house. And this is because for almost everybody, their home is their biggest asset. They've spent 20 years paying the thing off, if they have. Now, in South Africa, if you were to try and say, for example, take a residential area and a middle class area in Johannesburg, Cape Town, wherever it is, eThekwini, and you were to say, look, we need to build, we're going to go into this park in this nice residential area. The park's useful for your children, but we're going to use the park for accommodation. We're going to build the equivalent of RDP homes there. Now, that would reverse the trend that you're talking about. It would create more equality. It would create more social diversity in that area. But I guarantee you there'll be 115 court cases before it could be done.
Absolutely. And by the way, it's very interesting. You know, NIMBY is not new in South Africa. The people, the suburbs, the white suburbs around Alexandra in the north of Johannesburg, have articulated the idea of NIMBY for decades, since the 1920s. And there have been repeated attempts to get rid of Alexandra. So this idea of NIMBY is not new, but the issues that you raise are, I think, seriously important, and we need to confront that. But I'd say that there are a number of things that we need to take into account. One, we need to recognize that if we continue along the current path, of these spatial divisions that will be entrenched along racial and class lines, the problems that we see in the poorest areas of gender-based violence, high degrees of poverty, high degrees of malnutrition, etc., will simply multiply. And in fact, that will create an explosive cocktail of social conditions that will erupt as people try to improve their lives and try to stem the degradation of their lives and of their dignity. Secondly, we in a sense entrapped in the idea that the kind of public housing that should be provided to poor people should approximate the RDP housing. Now, many people have said this, the RDP houses in a sense were a necessity to deal with an urgent situation of homelessness, overcrowding that had developed over many decades up to the early 1990s. So the state had to intervene. But I think that we can probably agree that by and large, RDP houses are not of a good quality. They're not the kind of houses that most people should live in. There are some RDP housing complexes particularly in the recent period, that are much better, social housing and so on. So if we dispense with the idea that poor people should live in the kinds of houses that we see, the RDP houses, and imagine a different kind of housing, better quality housing, then I think one will probably be able to address some of the concerns that middle-class homeowners like you and me may have if poorer people move in. If you were to build RDP housing complexes in the middle of parkers, you will have a problem, I think. Okay? But if you build different kinds of housing, better social housing, in fact, that could improve also not only social interaction, but also what most middle-class homeowners want is an improvement in the value of their properties. Thirdly, and I should just make, I think that there are many opportunities that we still have. I was saying earlier that we've probably missed an opportunity, but we still do have opportunities where we can build different kinds of housing. Blocks of flats that look good, that are, socially good, in which, poor people can live, rental stock. We don't have anymore a significant, rental stock that would allow poorer people to live closer to the urban areas and to work opportunities. One could also say that the economic advantages of having people living closer to the city far outweigh the problem of NIMBY. Because if people are living closer to the work, they are in a better social condition. That could contribute to the building of houses, all sorts of, facilities that are required, schools and transport and so on, would in fact also contribute to injecting new energy into the economy. Therefore, hopefully less unemployment. All of these factors could contribute to, in fact, making our society better socially, politically, and economically. Now, this won't mitigate all the concerns of people who express NIMBY, but we have to make the argument, we have to persuade people that, in fact, it is not only in the interest of poorer people to live closer to the city, but it's in the interest of the entire country's long-term survival to intervene in this way. If we don't do it now, we are going to be confronted 20, 30 years down the line with a much greater problem. Then it may be too late to intervene, not in a social engineering way, as you suggested, but it may be too late for the state to intervene to counteract the problems associated with the kind of spatial divisions that we have. I would say quite strongly that either we do it now or it is going to be late. And then we have to confront the real concerns and legitimate concerns that people who own properties in middle-class areas have, but have that conversation openly and deal with it head-on and not impose a plan on people. But at the same time, as we've seen in the debate around the land issue, and if you wait too long to deal with an issue, you are going to confront a situation where the state has to intervene decisively, despite the concerns that some people may have, even if those concerns are legitimate.
Professor Noor Nieftagodien, I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed. Professor, well, technically of history, if I remember correctly, but actually looking here at the situation regarding our divisions, our lived divisions, if I could call them that.